Imagine a world where the horizon is a jagged line between survival and oblivion. Imagine a floating palace, the pride of the world's most powerful corporation, carrying enough silver to buy a kingdom and enough tension to ignite a war. Now imagine that ship shattering against a coral reef in the middle of the night, leaving hundreds of souls stranded on a cluster of barren, waterless islands. This is not a work of fiction. This is the story of the Batavia, a voyage that began with dreams of unimaginable wealth and descended into a nightmare of systematic slaughter, a proto-fascist mini-state, and a psychological descent into the darkest corners of the human soul. It remains, nearly 400 years later, the most harrowing tale of maritime disaster and human depravity in history. In October 1628, the Batavia set sail from Texel in the Netherlands. She was the jewel of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. She was a massive vessel, a brand-new retort ship designed to carry the riches of the Indies back to Europe. On board were over 300 people, high-ranking officials, wealthy merchants, soldiers, sailors, and families seeking a new life in the colonial capital of Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. But beneath the polished wood and billowing sails, the ship was a pressure cooker of resentment. The command of the ship was split, a recipe for disaster. Francisco Pelsart was the upper merchant, the man in charge of the cargo and the company's interests. Arion Jacobson was the skipper, the master of the sails and the sea. The two men loathed each other. Their animosity was rooted in a previous voyage, and on the cramped decks of the Batavia it festered. Jacobson resented being under the thumb of a landsman like Pelsart, while Pelsart looked down upon the crude, hard-drinking skipper. Entered Jeronimus Cornelisz. He was an apothecary from Haarlem, a man of intellect, charisma, and a deeply fractured moral compass. Cornelisz was fleeing a bankrupt business and rumors of heretical beliefs. He was a follower of a radical sect that believed that for the enlightened, sin did not exist. To the truly chosen, every action, no matter how cruel, was divinely permitted. On the long, sweltering journey across the Atlantic and around the Cape of Good Hope, Cornelisz and skipper Jacobson found common ground. They began to whisper of mutiny. Their plan was simple: seize the ship, murder Pelsart and anyone loyal to the company, and use the Batavia's cannons and silver to become pirates of the Indian Ocean. By the time the ship reached the vast, empty stretches of the southern Indian Ocean, the conspiracy was in motion. They staged a brutal assault on a wealthy passenger named Lucretia Jontz, hoping to provoke Pelsart into a harsh disciplinary action that would trigger a crew revolt. But Pelsart was ill, confined to his cabin, and hesitant to act. As the tension reached a breaking point, nature intervened with a violence that made the mutineers' plans irrelevant. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1629, the Batavia was screaming through the water at high speed. The lookouts mistook the white foam of breaking waves on the morning reef for moonlight reflecting on the sea. With a bone-shaking roar, the great ship slammed into the coral of the Houtman Abralos, an archipelago off the coast of Western Australia. The hull shattered, the masts snapped like toothpicks. In an instant, the dream of mutiny was replaced by the cold, wet reality of death. As the sun rose, the survivors looked over a desolate landscape. They were miles from the mainland, stranded on a series of flat, scrubby islands with no visible source of fresh water. Chaos reigned. While Pelsart attempted to maintain order and salvage supplies, the crew broke into the ship's liquor stores, getting drunk as the vessel groaned and disintegrated beneath them. Most of the passengers were ferried to a nearby island, now known as Batavia's Graveyard, while 40 men attempted to swim to safety. Pelsart quickly realized their situation was terminal. There was no water. Within days, the survivors would begin to die of thirst. In a desperate gamble, Pelsart, skipper Jacobson, and a handful of the best sailors took the ship's longboat, a mere 30-foot open craft, and set out to find water on the mainland. Finding none, they made the unthinkable decision to sail all the way to Java. It was a journey of over 1,500 miles in an open boat, a feat of navigation that remains legendary. But as they disappeared over the horizon, the 250 survivors left behind felt only one thing: abandonment. With Pelsart gone, the vacuum of power was filled by the highest-ranking official remaining on the islands, Jeronimus Cornelisz. He had spent 10 days clinging to the wreck of the Batavia before drifting to the island on a piece of timber. He arrived to find a desperate, frightened population. He saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. To Cornelius, the islands were a blank slate where he could finally realize his dark visions of absolute power. He began by consolidating control over the food and water that had been salvaged. He formed a private guard of soldiers, men he had groomed and seduced with promises of wealth and status. He knew that to maintain control, he had to reduce the number of people on the island. There simply wasn't enough water for everyone, and more importantly, there were too many people who might oppose him. Cornelius was a master of psychological manipulation. He didn't start the killing immediately. Instead, he broke the survivors into groups and scattered them across the different islands of the archipelago under the guise of searching for water. This ensured that no large force could rise against him. He sent a group of soldiers, led by a man named Wibby Hayes, to a high island in the distance. He gave them no weapons and told them to signal with smoke if they found water. Cornelius fully expected them to die of thirst, removing the greatest physical threat to his rule. Once the groups were divided, the terror began. Cornelius did not usually kill with his own hands. He forced his followers to do it. He wanted them bonded to him through the shared guilt of blood. They began with the weak. The sick and the elderly were murdered in their tents at night. Then they moved to anyone who questioned the Captain General, the title Cornelius had bestowed upon himself. The atmosphere on Batavia's graveyard became surreal and demonic. Cornelius draped himself in the finest silks and satins found in the salvaged chests of the wealthy passengers. He ate from silver plates while others starved. He distributed the jewelry of the VOC to his favorite executioners. He took Lucretia Yance, the woman who had been the target of the pre-wreck assault, as his forced concubine. The murders became increasingly sadistic and arbitrary. People were taken out into the bay in boats and pushed overboard to drown. Others had their throats slit in the middle of the night. A pregnant woman was strangled. Children were murdered to save on rations. Cornelius watched it all with a detached, divine arrogance, believing that, as one of the saved, he was incapable of sin. He created a kingdom of terror where the only law was his whim, and the only currency was death. Over 110 men, women, and children were slaughtered by Cornelius's inner circle during those horrific months. But while the darkness deepened on Batavia's graveyard, a light of resistance was flickering on a distant island. Against all odds, Wibby Hayes and his men had found water. They had discovered deep natural cisterns filled by the recent rains. They had also found wallabies, which they hunted for meat. Following Cornelius's instructions, they lit smoke signals to alert the main group, but instead of a rescue, they saw the silhouettes of survivors who had escaped the massacres, gasping out the truth as they paddled across the shallows on makeshift rafts.
Wibby Hayes was no philosopher or aristocrat. He was a common soldier, but he possessed a moral clarity that Cornelius lacked. He realized that the Captain General was a monster, and that his group was the only thing standing between the remaining survivors and total annihilation. Hayes and his men began to prepare for war. They had no swords, no muskets, no armor. They fashioned weapons from the debris of the sea, clubs with nails driven through them, morning stars made of heavy stones and ship's rigging, and shields made from barrel staves. When Cornelius realized that Hayes was not only alive but thriving, he was enraged. He could not allow a rival power center to exist. He launched a series of amphibious assaults on Hayes's island, but the terrain favored the defenders. Hayes's men fought with the desperation of those who knew that surrender meant a slow, agonizing death. They stood in the surf, waist-deep in water, beating back the well-armed mutineers with their primitive clubs. The elite soldiers of the mutiny, softened by their life of luxury and unopposed murder, were no match for the hardened, well-fed men led by Hayes. The stalemate frustrated Cornelius. He tried to use diplomacy, attempting to bribe Hayes's men with promises of silver and wine. He even crossed over to the island himself to negotiate, thinking his charisma would win the day. It was a fatal mistake. Hayes and his men didn't want silver. They wanted justice. They ambushed the negotiating party, captured Cornelius, and killed several of his lieutenants. The mutineers who remained on the main island were now led by a man named Wouter Los. They launched a final, desperate attack to rescue their leader and wipe out the resistance. The battle was at its peak, the air filled with the scent of salt and blood, when a miracle appeared on the horizon. A sail. It was the Sardam, a rescue vessel commanded by Francisco Pelsart. He had done the impossible. He had reached Batavia, secured a ship, and navigated back through the treacherous reefs to find his people. As the Sardam anchored, a desperate race began. Both the mutineers and Wiebe Hayes's men scrambled into their boats, rowing with every ounce of strength they had. The mutineers wanted to reach the ship first, to tell a lie, to claim they were the victims of a revolt and seize the vessel. Hayes wanted to tell the truth. Hayes won the race. He pulled alongside the Sardam, screaming to Pelsart not to let the approaching boats board, for they were murderers and mutineers. When the mutineers arrived, dressed in their blood-stained silks and finery, they were met not with open arms, but with the leveled muskets of Pelsart's guards.
The reckoning was swift and brutal. Pelsart was horrified by the stories he heard, the mass graves he found, and the sight of the broken, traumatized survivors. He established a court on the islands, for he feared that if he brought the mutineers back to the city of Batavia, the presence of so much silver would incite another mutiny on the rescue ship. The trials were exhaustive. Under the Dutch law of the time, confession was required for a death sentence, and Pelsart used the torture of water and fire to extract the truth from the mutineers. The details that emerged were so gruesome they shocked even the hardened sailors of the 17th century. They spoke of the butcher, a man named Jan Pelgrim who had begged to be allowed to kill children. They spoke of the night they slaughtered an entire family because they were too noisy. The sentence for Jeronimus Cornelisz was as poetic as it was harsh. Before he was taken to the gallows, both of his hands were chopped off with a hammer and chisel, the hands that had never personally spilled blood, but had signed the orders for 100 deaths. On October 2, 1929, on a bleak island in the middle of a lonely ocean, Cornelisz and his chief lieutenants were hanged. To the very end, Cornelisz showed no remorse, screaming to the heavens that he was a man of God and that Pelsart would be judged for this. 2 men were spared the gallows, but given a sentence that some might consider worse. Wouter Los and Jan Pelgrim were marooned on the mainland of Australia. They were given a small boat, some seeds and tools, and told to learn the language of the inhabitants and wait for a rescue that would never come. They became the first European residents of the Australian continent, their ultimate fate lost to the shifting sands of the outback. Pelsart eventually returned to the city of Batavia with the remaining survivors and the salvaged silver, but his reputation was ruined. The VOC blamed him for the loss of the ship and the lack of discipline that allowed the mutiny to brew. He died just a year later, a broken and disgraced man. Wiebe Hayes, however, who was hailed as a hero, promoted to a high rank and given a reward for his bravery. The wreck of the Batavia lay forgotten beneath the waves for over 300 years, a ghost story told by sailors. It wasn't until 1963 that divers finally located the site. What they found was a graveyard of history. They recovered the massive stone portico that was intended for the gates of the city of Batavia, still sitting in the cargo hold. They found the silver coins, the cannons, and most poignantly, the bones. Archaeologists have since excavated the islands, uncovering the shallow graves of the victims. Some skeletons show the clear marks of sword blows to the skull. Others were found in huddled groups, reflecting their final moments of terror. These remains serve as a silent, chilling testament to what happens when the thin veneer of civilization is stripped away. The story of the Batavia is often cited as a real-life Lord of the Flies, but it is arguably much darker. It wasn't just children losing their way, it was adults, governed by a sophisticated legal and corporate structure, succumbing to a calculated, ideological evil. It's a story of how one man's charisma, fueled by a dangerous philosophy of entitlement, can turn ordinary people into monsters. Yet it is also a story of the resilience of the human spirit. In the face of a literal kingdom of terror, a simple soldier and a group of unarmed survivors chose to fight back. They chose order over chaos and life over the cult of death. As we look back at the jagged reefs of the Abrolhos, the story of the Batavia remains a haunting reminder of the duality of our nature. It shows us that we are capable of both the most extraordinary feats of survival and navigation and the most incomprehensible acts of cruelty. The silver is long gone, the wood has rotted away, and the gallows have crumbled into dust, but the shadows of what happened on those islands in 1629 still linger, whispering a warning from the depths of the sea, that the most dangerous storms are not the ones that toss the ship, but the ones that rage within the human heart.